Okay, so well, thanks everyone for coming out today. My name is Stacey Belding. I'm the Human Rights and Diversity Officer here at the university. Before we begin, though, I do want to acknowledge that we are doing this work on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Ojibwe peoples and homeland of the Métis Nation. And particularly when we talk about human rights and issues related to human rights and equity, it's really important that we acknowledge that we are doing this work on those traditional territories. And so in terms of an agenda today, I was going to talk a little bit about the role of Human Rights and Diversity Office, as well as some key contacts in the office. I'll then briefly go through the legal basis for reasonable accommodation. I'll then detail the protections in the Respectful Working and Learning Environment policy, which is essentially an anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policy. I'll then talk a little bit about the accommodation process at the University of Winnipeg, so the role of accessibility services and the role of Human Rights and Diversity Office. And then I'll share some tips for working with professors and some other resources as well that you might find of interest. And then, of course, if time permits, happy to answer any question that folks have. So just in terms of the role of the Human Rights and Diversity Office, so we are an impartial body, so we're not an advocate for either party. Our role is really to ensure compliance with the Respectful Working and Learning Environment policy, or the RWLE, as well as compliance with human rights law, among other duties that we have. And so often what we do is we give people information about their rights and their options under the policy, availability of other resources, we provide referrals as needed, and really we're there for any member of our community. So faculty, staff, students, and administration can seek advice from us in connection with any concerns under the policy. In terms of accommodations, we're not generally directly involved with them, but we can assist as needed to ensure that reasonable accommodation is provided. And I'll talk a little bit about how that works at the university as well. And so just to give you a little bit of background about us, so as I mentioned, my name is Stacey Belding and I'm the Human Rights Diversity Officer. I've been with the university for almost 4 years now, and prior to that, I was a lawyer in private practice for about 11 years. I also worked as the Manager of Investigation and Policy Development at the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, as well as Counsel to Entrepreneurship Manitoba. With me today as well, popping in just to say hello, is our Sexual Violence and Human Rights Advisor, Himali Kruger-Bias. Hem, if you want to maybe give a little wave and say hi.
Hi, folks. Nice to be here with you today.
So Hema works with us primarily in the area of sexual violence, but as well as in the area of human rights. And she's a great resource if you've experienced sexual violence and you're looking for referrals to resources, whether inside the university or outside. Hema can also assist with accommodations. That could be like academic related accommodations, referrals to counseling, that kind of thing, in connection with disclosures of sexual violence. And so always encourage you to reach out to Hema if that happens to you. She's a great resource for us. So thank you today for coming out, Hema, to say hi to everybody. I know that it's really appreciated. As well, we have a complaints resolution advisor, Paul Carrick, who recently joined the office. And so Paul's primary role is in regard to complaints. So again, from any member of our community, and Paul's background is as a conflict resolution professional. He teaches conflict resolution at PACE, and he has a private practice in this area. He's also trained as a therapist and is the former Respectful Working and Learning Advisor for the government of Manitoba. So he recently joined our team in the last couple of months. So I would encourage folks with any issues to reach out to one of us. And if we think that you would be best speaking with someone else in our office, there's no wrong door. We'll refer you as needed, but certainly we're happy to provide advice and assistance to anyone. So I want to start by giving you a bit of an overview of the legal basis of the duty to accommodate and an overview of the Respectful Working and Learning Environment policy. And so I'll just mention this briefly so you have a little bit of background. So the RWLE incorporates concepts from the Human Rights Code and other legislation such as the the workplace safety and health regulation from the workplace health and safety legislation. And so pursuant to that legislation, we implemented the RWLE as our anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policy. So really incorporating those protections from human rights law and that other area of law that I mentioned. And so when I talk about accommodation and the duty to accommodate, that's because the failure to reasonably accommodate is considered discrimination under human rights law. And so we've incorporated those concepts into the policy. And the policy applies to students, staff, and faculty engaged in activities with a substantial connection to the university. So really, anything to do with your classes, even things like practicums or field trips or work abroad connected with the university is covered by the policy. It also applies to third parties or activities on university property. So if a third party is on our campus, they are expected to comply with the policy as well. Retaliation for bringing forward concerns under the policy is prohibited, as is breach of confidentiality. So if you come forward with concerns, all of that information is held in confidence. There are some exceptions to confidentiality, like if somebody is at risk of harming themselves or others, or if there's a live issue that needs to be addressed. Sometimes we do have to take action, but in general, all of the information you bring forward is confidential, and we don't take any action unless it's something that you're looking to see happen. So we'll work with you in terms of the solution that you're looking for to your concerns. But otherwise, all the information is held in confidence, and that duty of confidentiality is imposed on anyone who's working with the policy. The policy does have a complaints mechanism with formal and informal resolution options. So meaning that if you have a concern that your rights are not being complied with, then you can come forward and you can either seek an informal resolution, which is very often some type of negotiated resolution to your concerns. But if that's not successful, or if the situation persists, or it doesn't seem like informal resolution is possible, we also have a formal resolution option, which is typically that you would file a formal complaint and it would be referred to investigation by a third-party investigator. And that's assuming that the complaint demonstrates what's called a prima facie case, meaning that if we accept everything you've indicated in the complaint to be true, it would constitute a breach of the policy. There is a 1-year time limit for complaints though. So if you do have concerns, we do recommend that you reach out to us as soon as you can. And that, we can go from there in terms of looking at your options. So as I mentioned, the policy is an anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policy. And so discrimination is a legal term that comes from the Human Rights Code. And there's really two kinds of discrimination. One is what we call differential treatment, which is treating someone differently without reasonable cause on the basis of an actual or presumed characteristic, or there's failing to make reasonable accommodation. And so differential treatment is where your protected characteristics, so for example, your disability or your gender or your religion, for example, is a factor in an adverse treatment of you. So that could be imposing burdens on you or withholding access to opportunities or benefits available to others. And your protected characteristic doesn't have to be the only factor, but if it is a factor in that negative treatment, then it can be considered discrimination. And it doesn't matter if someone intended to discriminate, it's really the effect on the person that's important. And failing to make reasonable accommodation is connected to this as well. And that's where if you have a special need based on a protected characteristic, like, for example, if I am pregnant and I need time off to go to my medical appointments, or I have a disability and I need a service animal, those needs are based on a protected characteristic, and we are required to provide reasonable accommodation to meet those needs. So when I talk about a protected characteristic, what do I mean? So in the Human Rights Code, there is a number of characteristics that are protected. And so allegations of discrimination have to be based on as I said, differential treatment or failure to accommodate based on one of those characteristics. And so the code lists them here. And so they include ancestry, which is includes color or perceived race, nationality or national origin, ethnic background or origin, religion or creed, age, sex, including pregnancy, gender identity, sexual orientation, marital or family status, source of income, political belief, as well as physical or mental disability, including reliance on a service animal, a wheelchair, or other remedial device, and social disadvantage. So these are all the characteristics listed in the code, and they're all immutable characteristics, meaning that they're characteristics that are fundamental to ourselves and they're not changeable, or they're not easily changeable by us. The code also recognizes analogous grounds, which at the present time currently includes criminal record. So you can't discriminate against someone based on their criminal record, again, unless it's considered to be reasonable. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in terms of what is reasonable or unreasonable discrimination. So as mentioned, discrimination does include failing to make reasonable accommodation if those needs are based on a protected characteristic. And so when we talk about the duty to accommodate, really what it means is the obligation to take special measures to remove barriers for someone who has a special need based on a disability or another protected characteristic. So it's really meant to help level the playing field. So it's taking these actions in order to allow a person to participate on an equal basis. And so, as mentioned, protected characteristic includes those listed in the code. And so when we're talking about accommodation, more often than not, we're talking about disability-related needs, but it can also mean, needs based on a religious belief. So for example, if I'm not able to write an exam because I have a religious holiday, it can also be based on pregnancy or sex, family status. So for example, you can't refuse to hire me because you don't like my spouse, or you must also make reasonable accommodations. For example, if I have childcare needs that I can't otherwise accommodate. It can also come into play with things like gender identity, so using someone's correct gender affirming pronouns or name, as well as other characteristics. So if there's a need that arises from that characteristic, then that is potentially something that has to be accommodated. And accommodations should be provided on a timely basis. So, there shouldn't be any undue delay in providing the accommodation. So usually the person seeking accommodation, so in the case of a student, it's typically the student who must identify the need for accommodation, which would then put the onus on a service provider to engage in the process. So, generally in the case of University of Winnipeg, if it's a disability-related accommodation, usually a student would first go to AS to be registered, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And when accommodations requested, generally some reasonable evidence substantiating or clarifying the need is required to be provided. So usually in the case of disability-related needs, it would be medical, for example. And in general, you should provide that information, with ample notice if at all possible. The student must also, clarify anything about their needs. So if there's questions about their need, or if they have suggestions about what could meet their needs, that's also something that they should do. And they must also cooperate in the process. So a person that's seeking accommodation is required to be cooperative during the process as well. So that's providing feedback, providing that medical information, and ensuring that they follow through with their portion of the accommodation. So to give you some examples of what accommodation can look like, so, keeping in mind that every person is different, even different people with the same disability may have different needs, but there are some common accommodations that are provided. So for example, if I have a visual impairment, I might need some type of adaptive software like a screen reader or speech to text. If I have a mobility concern, then I might need an accessible washroom. I might also need extra time to write an exam or a note taker for class depending on the nature of my disability. I might need extensions for assignments. I might need additional breaks during an exam. I might have a requirement to eat something in class, like if my blood sugar is affected, that kind of thing. So those are just examples. And again, it will all be based on an individual's particular need and what their medical, what the medical supports as well. Non-disability related examples can include things like allowing someone time off to observe a religious holiday or for religious practices, rescheduling an exam due to childcare issues, and of course using someone's correct gender affirming name and pronouns are all examples of non-disability related accommodations. Excuse me. It's also important to note that accommodation must be provided to the point of undue hardship. So that means that, generally undue hardship is a cost issue or it's an issue related to safety. And it doesn't come up very often in the context of student-related accommodations. But for example, if somebody were to request an accommodation that was extremely costly, that might be a consideration, or if it might be unsafe for others in the institution, that could be considered undue hardship. But it's a high threshold, and it's pretty rare for for the university to reach the point of undue hardship in the context of these types of requests. But it's also important to note that it doesn't have to be a person's preferred accommodation. So sometimes people, for example, will request a particular adaptive software. Well, if that software is not available, or there's another one that's available that would reasonably meet someone's need, but it's not exactly what was requested, then that can still be provided because it is still reasonable, even if it's not the preferred accommodation. So as long as it reasonably meets someone's needs, sometimes there can be sort of interchangeability of accommodations. Now, what are the limits to accommodation? So there are some limits. Of course, as I mentioned, undue hardship is one limit. There's also bona fide academic requirements. So in general, in a class, there are particular things that have to be demonstrated by a student. And so, we're not required to compromise academic standards or change sort of the key the key standards in the course. So there are times when, for example, someone has to demonstrate their writing ability, or they have to demonstrate some other aspect of the class. So those bona fide academic requirements are one potential limit. Conflicting rights. So for example, if someone were to request an accommodation, but it would violate someone else's human rights, then that would generally constitute undue hardship. But realistically, we would have a duty to accommodate both parties' special needs based on a protected characteristic, and there's no hierarchy of rights. So in general, what ends up happening is that there is an accommodation of both parties or a balancing of those interests. So sometimes that does come up. For example, if somebody has a service animal and someone in the class has a really bad allergy, say to dogs, that might be something where we would have to, balance both parties' rights and provide accommodation to both parties. As well, the person seeking accommodation must cooperate in the process. So, they have to provide information to substantiate their need or restriction. They should make suggestions. They should try out options. So if they won't provide medical, or, don't respond, or, sort of reject all of the solutions that are reasonable or not perfect, but maybe not perfect, it can be found that the person, didn't cooperate, and therefore, that may limit the accommodation that can be provided. So it's really, being cooperative in the process. Again, as mentioned, it's, reasonable, not preferred accommodation. And in some cases, there is a requirement that parties access external funding where available. So there are some external funds available for certain types of accommodations. And so there are times when a person would be requested to access those funds, or the university may look to access those funds as well. So that's just a little bit about some limits. Any questions before I move on to the next portion where I talk more specifically about the process at the university?
Question.
Yeah.
How do you define, you said that there was, is academic integrity, how do you define that? What's your talking about set standards for a class. Could you go into more detail about that, please?
Yeah, like it's very specific to the class, right? So it's hard to say sort of, and make generalities about it. But for example, if there was a class that had to do with, writing, for example, like the real issue is one of the requirements was being able to write, a poem, for example, or, that's probably not the best example, but let me think of one where, like if there was, a certain procedure that needed to be performed, for example, or something that was really fundamental to the course itself, then that might be considered a bona fide academic requirement. So, typically those are determined in advance, that there would be already before the class starts, like these are already determined that these are sort of those bona fide academic requirements. But even sort of a little bit separate from that, but related, is that, of course, there's certain things that are being tested in the class. And so a student would have to demonstrate their proficiency in those areas, right? But oftentimes there is flexibility in terms of how you demonstrate those skills and abilities. So, unless writing is really fundamental to the class itself, maybe a person can demonstrate their knowledge of the material in a different way. So perhaps they can do it, in an oral exam versus a written exam, again, depending on the nature of the class. So every class is going to be a little bit different, and it's going to be specific to that class. But that just gives you an example of when, it could be seen as bona fide. And of course, students are required to sort of, still demonstrate proficiency in the same way, in that, standards are not lowered, right? And so it's really about providing accommodation in order to ensure that a person can participate in an equal basis with others and demonstrate their skills in a way that obviously meets their needs, but also, demonstrates that they've understood the material and that they're able to, demonstrate the skills that the class is designed to teach. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit vague because it's very dependent on the particular class, but hopefully that gives you some examples that are helpful. Any other questions, comments before I move forward? Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the specific process at the university. And so I've included some information here about how you would go about seeking disability-related accommodations. And so, so as I mentioned earlier, accessibility services is the department at the university that primarily handles disability-related accommodations. And so the first step would be that you would book an appointment with an accessibility services advisor, or if you have a hearing impairment, it would be with the deaf and hard of hearing services advisor. And during that initial meeting, the AS advisor will discuss with you the three main areas of accommodation offered through AS. So that could be campus accommodations, classroom accommodation, and test/exam accommodations. And then together, you and the AS advisor will determine your accommodation needs. During the meeting, you'll also be given a medical documentation request form that would be then completed by your health practitioner. So then following the meeting, of course, you would have your medical documentation request form completed. And so your health practitioner, so typically a family doctor, but it could be a specialist, would complete the form that would explain the nature of your disability or health concern, including any functional limitations or accommodations related to post-secondary. So that, you know, that's really speaking specifically to the limitations in the post-secondary environment. So what impacts does your disability or medical condition have on your ability to do the work in school? So they don't have to disclose your diagnoses. It's really about the general nature of the disability and what are those functional limitations. If you have a learning disability, you can provide AS with a copy of your psychoeducational report. If you have a temporary injury, then AS will require a doctor's note stating the date of the injury, the nature of the injury, and the approximate recovery time. So that's the general overview of the process. Once you're in the class, you know, you certainly want to let AS staff know if you're having any difficulties, if anything changes. So if your condition changes, or if there's any changes to your course, or if you change your personal information, you would want to let AS staff know about those changes. And so, you know, if you are having difficulties receiving accommodation, of course, you know, you will want to talk with your professor directly or talk with AS. And if those concerns are not resolved, then you can always contact our office by email or phone to discuss. And, you know, AS, of course, is able to reach out to us as well. And so our goal would be to help resolve any dispute about the accommodation itself. So just to give some examples of what available accommodations are, and again, keeping in mind that accommodations are individualized to the student, but here are some common accommodations that are offered at the university. So in the classroom, it can be access to a volunteer note taker. It could be priority front row seating, use of personal adaptive technology in class, extended time for assignments, or ASL services or computerized transcription. So those are all examples of accommodations that could happen in the classroom. Other things could be, of course, you know, you have your service animal in class, for example, you know, that kind of thing. Also around campus, you know, we do have accessible parking, accessible lockers, we have accessible workstations in the main campus library, and of course we have accessible gender neutral washrooms as well. So AS can let you know about those accommodations also. And then for tests and exams, some examples of accommodations can include extended time, a quiet space, assistance from a reader or scribe, access to word processing software, or deferred exams. So again, just examples of accommodations that can be provided. So again, this is going to be based on your particular needs and, you know, what the medical information supports in terms of available accommodations. So very much individualized to your case, but these are some common accommodations that are offered. What about non-disability related accommodations? So in those cases, those are not requests that are handled through AS. So very often those requests will be made directly to a professor, you know, or those are things that you could inquire with our office about in terms of, you know, some suggestions about how to approach those things, or if you would like us to approach your professor about it, you could certainly reach out to us. But I just wanted to give you some examples of those accommodations as well. So, for example, if you have a religious holiday on a date that, you know, classes are being held normally, you know, if you have an exam scheduled for that day or a class scheduled for that day, you know, you can request that the exam be written on a different day, or that you be absent from class, for example. If you're pregnant, you know, you might need time off for medical appointments related to your pregnancy. You know, you can also request your correct gender affirming name in class. So even if that doesn't match the name in your birth certificate or in your registration, you can still request that your professor use your correct gender affirming name in class. You know, if there are meals being offered in a certain context, then, you know, you can ask for options for any religious dietary restrictions, for example. If you're a parent and you have a child who's hospitalized or becomes ill, or you're not able to find them childcare, and say you're a single parent, for example, you can make a request that your exam be deferred, because that would be considered, potentially a family status accommodation. Or if you've experienced sexual violence, you can request academic related accommodation. So that could be extra time to complete a paper, or it might mean an exam deferral. Again, depending on what your particular needs are, those are some accommodations that we can offer in those cases. So just some examples. Again, not an exhaustive list. It really depends on your particular needs and what you're looking for. But never hesitate to reach out and discuss what some possibilities could be for you in those situations as well. Yeah. So I wanted to share as well some tips for working with professors. And so, this information I've gathered from research that I've done, so looking at what are some best practices that are offered. And at the end, I'm going to include some links to some wording that you can use if you are looking to meet with your professors, to talk about your accommodations. There's some wording you can use that might be of assistance to help you sort of start that conversation. So, when you register with AS, one of the things that you can do is you can request that a letter of accommodation be generated through their portal. And that letter of accommodation can then be provided to your professors, and that will outline, the general accommodations that you need. However, it can be helpful for you to meet with professors so that, they can ask any questions, or, you could provide clarification about how accommodations could work in their classroom. And so, it's not a bad idea to schedule a time with them to talk about those things. So again, the letter of accommodation will set things out, but sometimes there are some questions that can arise, and it's helpful to have that communication. And so, the recommendation is that you make an appointment with them to see them at a mutually agreeable time, or during office hours. And you'll want to email them, or you'll want to call them or talk to them after class about setting a time. It's better not to just try to have that full conversation after class, because there tends to be other students around, they might be kind of rushed, so it's not a really private setting conducive to having the conversation. So, it's better to schedule a time where you can meet privately. Where possible, it's helpful to meet with them before the class begins or at the beginning of the term. Otherwise, if it's an issue that arises sort of throughout the term, or you just register with AS midway through the term, or something happens where your medical needs arise partway through the term, then of course you can meet with them at a later time, and try to give them as much notice as possible about the meeting, and prepare for the meeting in advance. So you certainly aren't obligated to share information about your disability. You certainly don't have to share diagnoses. You don't have to share any more information than what's in the letter of accommodation. But if you're comfortable, you can share additional information, in order for them to better understand the medical condition that you have. So again, it's totally at your option. You can simply say you're a student with a disability, and you can describe your accommodation needs. In general, they'll be set out in your letter of accommodation anyway, so you could provide more details, more specific about it. And you don't really need to, provide more detail about the particular condition, but if you would like to, or if you think it would be helpful, certainly it's open to you to do that as well. So some helpful information you can consider sharing, again, depending on your comfort level. You can talk about how your disability may impact you both in and outside of the classroom. What are your strengths and your challenges as a student and as a learner? Any particular concerns you may have about the course, so you can ask for some clarification there. Things that have been particularly helpful to you in past academic settings can be helpful. And try asking your professor how they would like you to communicate if you're facing a challenge. So if you're falling behind on an assignment, or your attendance may be impacted, what is the best way for you to communicate communicate with them. So those are all things that you could consider discussing. But again, depending on the situation, there might be other information that is helpful for you to share or for you to ask, from your professor. And maintain communication. So, if issues arise throughout the course, you certainly want to keep the lines of communication open, let them know if you're having challenges. Ideally, let them know as much in advance as you can, so that there's time for them to sort out things. And follow up with accessibility services if you have any concerns about the implementation of your accommodation. Very often, it's something that AS can assist with and sort things out or answer any questions the professors may have, especially if they're not, if they're new or they haven't provided many accommodations, they may have some questions. So, certainly reach out if you need assistance. But if that concern doesn't get resolved, then either AS or you as a student can contact our office for assistance as well. So definitely start, if you have concerns, probably the best place to start is to speak directly with your professor. You can remind them that you do have, a documented medical condition and you have documented accommodations. So that's probably a good place to start. If that's not successful, then you can consider talking with accessibility services, and then as needed, our office can become involved to help resolve the issue. So those are some tips that I wanted to share. And so I wanted to share some on and off campus resources as well that could be helpful. So the University of Winnipeg does have an accessibility plan that is created every 2 years and is uploaded to our website. So, if you want to have a look there, and you can see some of the initiatives that we're working on and that we've implemented, and it has some useful information there. We also have an accessibility hub. So this is sort of a centralized place where we keep a lot of our accessibility related information. So, many of these links are there. We also have links to, third-party resources like organizations, societies, that kind of thing. We also have an accessibility map. So, it'll show you sort of where the best places to park are. So that's another piece of information you might want to look at. And again, in the accessibility hub, there'll be other links there that, you may want to have a look at as well. Of course, accessibility service and deaf and hard of hearing services. I've included a link there to their office, and there's a lot of really great information on their website as well that you can check out. The library has its own page related to accessibility. So there's more details in that section. Students with disabilities are also eligible for additional financial resources. And so there is a list of awards and scholarships that are available in that link, and they're connected to, the university, but it also includes awards outside the university as well. And I've also included a website, disabilityawards.ca, which has a database of scholarships for students with disabilities that it's worth having a look at as well. The UWSA Accessibility Lounge, of course, is another great resource. I believe that the physical lounge is closed at the moment due to COVID, but you can always reach out to them as well. And of course, UWSA is a great resource, if you're needing some advocacy as well. And so, of course, we recommend that you reach out to them as needed as well. There's also a tip sheet that Accessibility Service has created with regard to requesting accommodation. So I've included a link there, and that's on their website, and it sort of gives you some suggestions for requesting accommodations and having those addressed. I was also able to find some sample wordings for emails to professors. And so I know for some students, they're not sure how to start the conversation, or they might be, concerned about bringing concerns to professors, or they might be concerned about disclosing information to professors. So I was able to find a website that has some suggested language about how you can approach the conversation. So, of course, you could feel free to put things in your own words, but if you're sort of struggling to figure out how do I best approach the situation, I've included some sample wording there. And really, it's, keep in mind that, you are supported by the policy, you do have supports on campus. So, You know, don't hesitate to reach out if you have particular needs. You know, the policy does say that you need to be reasonably accommodated. AS is a great resource if you're having any difficulty. Of course, there's my office as well. So, you know, I would say if you have needs, like, don't hesitate to reach out, and know that you have support, both in terms of these resources, but in terms of the policy as well, right? I've also included a couple of links to organizations that are focused on learning disabilities. So Learning Disabilities Association of Manitoba, as well as the Learning Disability Association of Canada. They have some great resources on their website as well. And then for other disability related organizations, in our accessibility hub, we have a whole list of tools and resources. So again, for many different types of disabilities, as well as you know, online resources that you can access as well. So I would encourage you to check those out. And I should mention that, you know, I can certainly share these resources with folks who reach out to me. And I'll also be putting a copy of the slides on our website as well. So if you, you know, want to have access to those resources, you know, those will be available. Okay, so then mental health. So, you know, certainly with COVID, we know that, you know, many folks are struggling with their mental health even more than before. So I included some links, you know, with regard to student wellness. So most people know that there are counseling resources on campus. So I would encourage folks to reach out to them if you have any concerns about, you know, how you're coping right now, and whether it's COVID related or not. They're a great resource for students. Clinic also has drop-in counseling, and Clinic has a crisis support line as well. So for folks that are struggling with mental health and, you know, they either want assistance more quickly than they can get from student wellness, or if it's after hours, or you would rather have a off-campus resource, then Clinic is a great resource for that as well. I've included links to the Respectful Working and Learning Environment policy, as well as links to related legislation and other policies. So some of the main links would be, for example, to the Human Rights Code, the Workplace Health and Safety Regulation. Also, some other good resources would be the Disabilities Issues Office of Manitoba. They have some great resources as well. I would also encourage folks to check out the Human Rights and Diversity Office website. There are some good resources there. We're actually going to be creating a student resources section, and we'll be posting these slides on that website as well. So there's some good information on our website. And of course, the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, you know, publishes policies about human rights and the interpretation of human rights and different pieces of that legislation. So that's a great resource, you know, to have clarification about what some of these concepts mean or how they play out, you know, in this context. Of course, if folks are not, you know, don't think that their rights are being respected, then the Manitoba Human Rights Commission is recourse for people that believe they're being discriminated against. And so, you know, if you do have those concerns, of course, you are entitled to contact the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, and they can certainly provide you with some advice and direction as well. So that brings us to the end. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I do think there is a question in the chat I'm going to see about answering here.
Hi, I have a question if that's okay.
Sure.
So thank you for the thorough presentation. I was wondering if the counselors you mentioned at Student Wellness would be able to provide that medical documentation for AS?
I don't believe that they can, but maybe I will put Lara on the spot and ask her. I'm sorry, Lara. I just want to be sure I'm telling the right information.
Hi, yeah, no problem. Yeah, so when students register with us, some students already have medical documentation for, say, being in high school already, or they've come from another post-secondary institution. So if they have that, we'll review it and see if it's still, you know, not expired and is good. It's still a good fit for the services that they need here. We do have our own medical documentation. It's a generic form. So that is what most students will use to take to their health practitioner, whoever it may be, a physician, a neurologist, a psychologist. And in that medical form that we give to students, the focus is on the accommodations, the nature of the disability, what the functional limitations are, and then they would get that filled out with their health practitioner. They send it back to us, and then we work through the accommodations and then just set up everything and kind of move forward with that. So yeah, some have medical documentation before, some use our form because they don't have any. So it just depends on the person.
Thank you, Lara. Okay, so I see Amy McGreevy has his hand up. Do you want to ask a question? Hi.
Thank you. This is a hypothetical question, but it's a conversation point that has come up. I am the biological safety officer for the University of Winnipeg, and one of the questions that has been raised in the Department of Biology has been about service animals and lab spaces. And I was wondering if you knew if that had been settled or if there was sort of guidelines in terms of how to draw. To this point, I don't believe it's been an issue, but it would be nice to know, to be able to let people know in advance if this is something that comes up. It would be something that we could have a policy in place for, as opposed to it being a surprise in September.
Yeah, and so I don't know the answer, unfortunately, but I can give you some, I guess, general information, and then I can follow up. You know, I can look into it further and get back to you. So I'm just going to make a note to see. So, I mean, in general, like, safety is definitely a key consideration, right? And so if it were that, and I'm not aware of the specifics of this particular scenario, but if there was a risk to health or safety, particularly vis-a-vis others, then that would be a consideration. And so if that were the case, you know, it may be that the university would have to look for an alternative way of accommodating the student while they're in the lab, for example, you know, to sort of provide alternate accommodation. So I think it's really going to come down to safety, would sort of be my sort of more general answer. But I see Lara has her hand up, so I don't know if Lara can speak more to it.
Yeah, so basically it has not happened that often over the 10 years that I've been here, but the focus is whenever a student has a support animal, they are supposed to inform their instructors before the start of the term to let them know that they have this, so it is not a surprise to the instructor and classmates. So that's what they're supposed to do. I'm not saying it always happens, but that's what's supposed to happen. But the key thing regarding animals, whether it's in a classroom or whether it's in a bio lab or a chem lab, is around behavior control. Thus that relates to safety. So if an animal, any animal, is supposed to be properly behaved, whether they're in campus living or it doesn't really matter. So if something was to happen where, you know, an animal was not behaving properly in the lab, then they would need to be removed and training and or further steps taken. So that would happen in classroom or lab or campus residence or anything. So kind of the safety behavior kind of ties hand in hand, because typically they're just supposed to sit there and behave. And then they typically don't pose any kind of a safety factor to any other students and or chemicals or things that might be on tabletops.
Thank you. We have a few labs where people work with infectious things, and I feel like that would be an entirely different realm of discussion. But thank you very much.
Yeah, like, I agree. I think that is that would you know, make the safety piece even more critical and more important in terms of the discussion. And so yeah, definitely sort of an important piece to know, right? So does that pretty much answer your question for now, though?
I think so. Yeah. This was sort of a, do we know if there is a rule in advance for a situation that has never come up and in all likelihood may not? But part of my job is to anticipate what these things might do when they happen. So yeah, I was just curious to get expert opinions on that. Thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you. I do see in the chat there was a question about a request for accommodation that included recording a lecture. And so on that question, I would say that, you know, I don't think that's I think that's probably a common request. And I think if you're delivering a class by Zoom, for example, you know, that could be something where you record your Zoom presentation or you allow a student to record the Zoom presentation. I don't think it requires that you know, go into the studio to do a different, you know, sort of version of the class. I think the recording would be, you know, potentially by the student or by the professor, you know, on Zoom. So not to sort of have like it done separately, if that makes sense. So I would say, yes, that would be probably a reasonable request and, you know, I think fairly common request. So hopefully that helps to answer that question. Lara, yes.
Yeah, just for clarification on that. So it is an accommodation that some students have, is permission to record the lecture. There is a feature, so some instructors know this and some do not. So there is a feature if you're using Zoom lecture format or, you know, that kind of typical format that profs have been using, you can enable the audio recording feature on it, and you can actually enable it for just that student if you want to. And we do in AS have a audio recording contract. So if an instructor is worried about sharing of course content, the student signs the privacy contract, the instructor signs it, sees it, and it's basically that the student does not share the recording with anyone. It's just for their study purposes, and then when the term is over, they delete it all.
Great, thank you, Lara. Hopefully that helps answer the question. I see another question in the chat. Oh, okay, I see the, okay, sorry, further to that, I see the person can't make it to campus and the course is in a classroom, not on Zoom. Okay, so yeah, I agree. Meeting with AS to talk about it is probably the best bet, yeah, to figure out how that could be done. Another question was, can I encourage professors to change settings of quizzes? So if there's one where I can't return to a question I answered and want to give it a better answer. Yeah, like I think there's nothing wrong with having a discussion and, you know, asking directly if there's a way that the professor, you know, could make the quiz, you know, more accessible. Like, you know, if there's a documented, like this sounds like more of a general question, but it, you know, it's probably, you know, not a bad feature to have that would be, you know, helpful to many students to be able to go back to questions, you know, once they've reviewed them. So, you know, I don't think it hurts to have a discussion with a professor about things like that. But, you know, I don't know if it's actually possible to do. And I see Lara has her hand up, so maybe she can speak to that.
Hi, so yeah, regarding the first one, basically if the class is stated as a campus class, that's the format that was, you know, in the student planning system, it is an on-campus course. It typically cannot be changed 99.9% of the time. The classroom has been booked through scheduling, typically months in advance, and that is the format that the entire class is expecting the course to be delivered in. So when you sign up for a campus class, it's a campus class. That does not mean that you cannot connect with the instructor and share your question or concern, and maybe they can do something, but that is at the instructor discretion. So an online course is an online course and a campus course is a campus course. There's been a lot of queries regarding that. This winter term, we are 70% campus and 30% online. So we're moving towards the direction of, you know, going back to, you know, ultimately at some point 100% on campus. So there's that piece of it. And then just regarding, I'm trying to remember, there was a question, just let me check the chat just to help clarify the other part. Oh, and regarding the quizzes and tests, yes, with online learning and online testing, typically most tests are set up that you can't return to a page. Once you finish the 5 questions on the page, you can't go back. That is very common. It has been an issue for you know, some students in accessibility and some, you know, not in accessibility. You can ask your professor if they are willing to activate the back and forth, and some will and some won't. It isn't, it's kind of at their discretion again if they choose to do that. And the reason why they're doing that, not that you who just asked the question are cheating, but it's for the reasons of academic integrity, to be like, these are the questions, you answer them, move on, so that, you know, people aren't looking at their books and going back and things like that. That's the reason for not being able to review pages, is due to online environment, to keep academic integrity, because it is very different than being in a classroom and being really closely monitored. So, but you can definitely ask your professor, but they do not have to do it, because it's just a formatting of testing now.
So I think that should be the end of our session for today. So thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, Stacey, for the presentation. If any of you have any question regarding accessibility or advocacy that the UWSA can support you, feel free to contact us, and then we'll be more than happy to help you throughout the process. Thanks everyone.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone. Have a great day. Take care.